I'm Nora Whitfield, 24. And on the night my family rented a rooftop to celebrate my graduation, my father lifted a microphone and told a room full of people I was no longer part of them. The words floated over white roses and glassware as if they belonged to someone else's life. I didn't argue. I set a manila folder on the table between us, the paper heavier than it looked, and watched his eyes flick to my name on the first page. I could feel the city humming around us, a low electric thrum beneath the strings quartet. Somewhere in that hum was the sound of doors closing and another one opening. I had spent years building something he refused to see. I had learned to let silence do the speaking when truth arrived. And that night it did. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever been told to be someone you're not, tap like and subscribe so more people who need this story can find it. I grew up in a house where the walls held diplomas, and the dinner conversations sounded like arguments with judges even when no one was angry. My father ran a respected firm. My mother hosted fundraisers, and I learned early how to smile at strangers who already knew our last name. We were taught to hold doors, write thank you notes, and never raise our voices in public. Kindness mattered, so did control. I liked the first part more than the second. While my cousins toured law schools and posted photos of clerkships, I was the kid with a secondhand laptop torn open on my bedroom desk, tracing packets as if they were footprints searching for what the internet tried to hide. My parents called it curiosity when I was little. Later they called it a phase and waited for it to pass. Money wasn't the question at home, but acceptance always seemed to have a price. The hallways smelled like polished wood. The cars were washed even when it rained, and I learned what it meant to look appropriate. Then I stepped into campus life, where no one cared about last names if your code shipped and your tests ran clean. A coffee shop receipt could be a sketch pad, a midnight idea could become a sprint by morning, and the clothes that mattered were hoodies that didn't itch. The distance between those two worlds wasn't measured in miles. It was measured in who decided your worth, people who introduced you by pedigree or teammates who introduced you by what you built. I didn't stop loving my family because I loved a different future. I just stopped asking for permission to try it. The night I met Maya, she was upset about how a relative's medical data had been sold, and I watched the way her hands moved when she said the word privacy, like it was an heirloom someone had taken without asking. We drafted the first sketch of Harbor Shield on a napkin that wouldn't lie flat, and by dawn, there was a prototype folder on my desktop named after the street where that cafe sat. Dylan joined us when his pitch deck for yet another dating app made him sigh. He wanted to work on something he could put his name on without flinching. We worked around classes, found a rhythm between burritos, fire alarms, and bug fixes, and decided that for a while my name wouldn't be anywhere public at all. I told myself the secrecy was about clean data and fair meetings, but it also kept the peace at home. My father believed law meant stability and respect, and anything else threatened the family's neat, heavy story. He wasn't unkind in small moments. He still held my mother's coat, still asked about my classes. But when the question turned to what came next, his voice grew careful and final the way it did in court. He sent links to LSAT courses and legacy scholarships with the subject line, "Just options." I didn't forward those to my friends. I learned to say I was working retail on weekends. I learned to live on less and make it look easy. Harbor Shield started catching small leaks inside our closed beta stray transfers that didn't belong where they landed, and each time the alert popped, I felt the same quiet certainty I'd felt the first time I tracked a signal to its source. Joanna Park saw our demo at a campus forum and asked to meet. She didn't ask who my parents were. She asked for logs, for benchmarks, for a plan that didn't break when traffic spiked. When she offered early funding, it came with a condition, my real name on the paperwork, and the courage to stand in the light I'd been avoiding. I said I needed a night to think, and then I stood on the roof of our building while the city blinked like a server room, each window a status light, and I understood this was not about rebellion. It was about calling something what it already was. I wish I could say the acceptance at home followed, but change didn't arrive as a conversation. It arrived as delays, as questions that sounded like warnings, as a new kind of quiet that felt colder than the old kind. My mother watched the weather and asked if I was eating enough. I told her yes. My father asked if I'd come to my senses by spring. I told him I had, though not in the way he meant. I signed with Joanna, and we took 3 desks in a shared space that smelled like coffee and soldering iron squeezed between a wellness startup and a man building something for cats that sounded impossible. We were small and alive. Graduation loomed like a calendar event we couldn't move, and the invitations went out with gold edges and embossed names. I bought a simple dress and kept my folder close. I planned to be polite to sit through a speech, to leave early, and catch the late train back to Brooklyn, where the real work waited on a whiteboard that never stayed clean for long. I imagined a night of polite toasts and a handshake on the way out, nothing more. But on that rooftop, with the skyline shining like a promise no one could keep for me, my father chose a different script and reached for a microphone. And just before his voice rose over the music, I felt the weight of paper in my purse and knew which story I would answer with. The night of the dinner lingered in my mind long after I left the rooftop. The air had been sharp, but not colder than my father's voice when he said I was no longer family. He had announced it with the same tone he used to close a case, calm and absolute, as if cutting me off were a legal proceeding. I'd walked out before dessert, the sound of applause still echoing behind me. No one had stopped me, not even my mother, who sat frozen with her hands clasped around her wine glass. For weeks after, I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. I buried myself in work at the shared office, surrounded by cables, empty coffee cups, and the hum of servers that made more sense than most people did. But it wasn't long before the fallout reached me. A call from the university's financial office came first, asking if I'd resolved the discrepancy with my final tuition payment. I hadn't realized the last installment had been held back. Then my housing stipend failed to arrive, followed by a quiet note that my campus meal plan had been deactivated. At first, I thought it was an error. I remember standing at the campus registrar window, rain dripping from my hair as I tried to explain. The clerk just frowned at the screen and said, "It looks like the account was suspended by the payer." I didn't need to ask who that was. That night I called home. My mother answered. Her voice was soft, but her words were the same script she always used when my father's decisions made no sense. "Your dad wants to see you make more responsible choices," she said. "If you just talk to him about the law track again." I hung up before she finished. For 2 days I lived on crackers and the half-empty peanut butter jar I found in Maya's cupboard. I didn't tell her what was happening, not right away. She was already juggling her design thesis and Harbor Shield's user interface, and I didn't want pity. But when she found me one night asleep at my desk, she didn't ask questions. She just slid a takeout box beside my laptop and said, "You can't code on fumes, Whitfield." I smiled, but my chest felt heavy. That was when I realized this wasn't just punishment, it was strategy. My father wanted to make sure I couldn't survive without the safety net he controlled. I started freelancing again, small security audits for local businesses that barely covered rent but kept the lights on. Most nights I worked until the sky turned gray, trying to hold my grades steady while testing new builds for Harbor Shield. There were days when the exhaustion blurred everything, but the code kept me grounded. It was proof that something in my life still made sense, even if the rest didn't. Then one afternoon, Maya burst through the door, waving her tablet. "You need to see this," she said, out of breath. On the screen was an email from a woman named Joanna Park, a partner at a small angel fund in Brooklyn. She had seen our early prototype through a campus innovation forum and wanted to meet. My stomach tightened. It didn't feel real. I reread the message twice before whispering, "She thinks it's good enough." Maya grinned. "She thinks it's worth funding." That meeting changed everything. I told my parents I was volunteering at a tech conference that weekend, then took the subway to Brooklyn with a worn backpack and a folder of notes. Joanna met us at a cafe near the bridge, her blazer rolled at the cuffs, her questions direct and precise. She didn't smile much at first, but by the time we finished, she said, "You've built something solid. It's early, but you have a sense of purpose. I don't see often." When she offered us a small seed investment, it felt like oxygen after months of holding my breath. Still, there was one thing I couldn't tell her. I wasn't just an independent founder trying to prove a product. I was a daughter trying to disappear from her father's shadow. I had removed my last name from everything connected to Harbor Shield. Online, I went by my first and middle names. To investors, I was simply Nora Elise. The secrecy wasn't just about privacy, it was survival. I didn't want the Whitfield reputation to open doors I hadn't earned or close them before I knocked. By winter, the pressure from home had shifted from cold silence to constant surveillance. My father started calling again. Sometimes he would leave voicemails that sounded almost gentle at first, asking about my classes or health, but they always ended with the same question: have you registered for the LSAT yet? When I stopped answering, the tone changed. His emails arrived with phrases like course correction and commitment to family values. One message simply said, "It's not too late to fix this." I didn't reply. Instead, I doubled down. Maya and I worked through every break, turning our apartment into a lab. Dylan handled the business side, negotiating with testers and mapping growth projections. By spring, we had a working system with real users, a small beta group of 25 volunteers whose data logs told us more than any classroom could. The day our firewall blocked its first live breach attempt, I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. We were no longer building theory. We were protecting something real. That night, while Maya celebrated with cheap champagne, I checked my email and found another message from my father. Attached was a glossy brochure for a legacy fellowship at his firm, complete with my name penciled into the sample letterhead. The subject line read, "Still time to make the right choice." I closed the laptop without reading the rest. The longer I built my own path, the more determined he became to pull me back. My Uncle Robert called soon after under the pretense of concern. "Your father's just looking out for you, Nora," he said. "You have a future here. Don't throw it away chasing computer experiments." His voice carried the same polished condescension that always lingered at holiday dinners. I thanked him for his call and promised to think about it. The moment I hung up, I deleted every law school link still sitting in my inbox. What they didn't know was that Joanna had just formalized the offer, $250,000 in seed funding for 12% equity. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to move Harbor Shield out of our apartment and into a small co-working space downtown. Enough to buy servers that didn't overheat and coffee that didn't taste like despair. I signed the contract that night, but along with the offer came a new decision. Joanna wanted me to sign as the legal CEO, no aliases, no initials, no hiding. I froze when she said it. Using my full name would expose everything I'd kept separate for years. My father's circles would notice. The family firm's clients might recognize it. For hours, I stared at the unsigned paperwork on my screen, hearing my father's voice in my head, warning me that every wrong move would ruin the Whitfield name. That night, I climbed to the roof again. The city looked like 1,000 lit windows, each one a small decision someone made and stood by. Maya joined me with 2 paper cups of coffee. "You'll have to tell them eventually," she said. I nodded. "But not yet. Not until I can show them." She smiled, not pushing further. When I went back inside, I opened the document again. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time before typing the words, "Nora Whitfield, CEO, Harbor Shield." I hit send. 3 hours later, Joanna replied with one word, "Finally." The next morning, I walked into our shared workspace for the first time with my full name attached to everything we built. The sign on the wall was just a decal, cheap, slightly crooked, but seeing Harbor Shield Technologies printed beside my own name gave me a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. For once, I didn't feel like I was hiding. Outside that new office window, the skyline shimmered, faintly sunlight, catching on glass towers that once symbolized everything my father valued: prestige, power, control. Inside, the hum of our servers was steady, confident, alive. For the first time, I felt something stronger than fear of his disapproval. I felt ownership. Graduation was only a few months away. I hadn't planned on attending the dinner that came with it, but the invitations kept arriving handwritten in gold script, addressed to Miss Nora Whitfield and family. I left them unopened in a drawer. I didn't know yet that my father had his own plans for that night, and that he intended to make a spectacle of cutting me off once and for all. By the time spring came, Harbor Shield had outgrown the quiet corners where it was born. We moved into a small co-working space near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, 3 desks, second-hand chairs, and a coffee maker that only worked if you hit it twice. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Maya set up her design sketches along one wall, Dylan brought a whiteboard he'd rescued from a startup auction, and I installed our server on a table made from a hollow door. Every hum from that server reminded me that we were building something alive. Outside those walls, my family still believed I was dabbling, working retail or tutoring, until I came to my senses. My father's last message before graduation had ended with the words, "Don't embarrass yourself trying to chase a fantasy." I hadn't answered. I was too tired to defend a dream that was already real. That semester was the hardest I'd ever faced. Between classes, product testing, and client meetings, I was rarely home before midnight. When money ran short, I skipped meals and picked up extra audits for small businesses that couldn't afford proper cybersecurity. The pay wasn't much, but each project kept Harbor Shield afloat. I told myself I'd rest after graduation, though I knew that day would come with its own storm. In March, Joanna called with news that made my heart stop for a moment. "Nora," she said, "a healthcare startup is willing to test Harbor Shield's beta for internal data leaks. It's not a full contract yet, but if the system works, it could lead to funding." I could barely hear her over the noise of our tiny office, but I caught every word that mattered. I told her we'd be ready in 2 weeks. We worked 16-hour days after that, fixing bugs, refining code testing again and again until our eyes blurred. When the client reported that our software had flagged 2 real breaches in the first week, I felt something shift deep inside me. For the first time, the world outside our screens had proof that our idea worked. That same week, my father hosted a dinner at his firm, celebrating a new partnership. My uncle sent me photos from the event, Thomas smiling beside a wall of silver plaques, my mother's pearls catching the light. Under one photo, he'd written, "Still room for you here, if you're ready to come home." I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Back at the office, Maya found me sitting by the window long after everyone else had gone. "You don't have to read their emails," she said quietly. "You're allowed to move on." I nodded, but the truth was harder to admit. I wasn't ready to stop hoping that maybe one day he'd see me. Not the name, not the rebellion, just me. As the end of the semester drew closer, my father's tone shifted again. His calls came through at odd hours, his voice clipped and rehearsed. "Graduation dinner is on the 20th, he said once, as if it were an order, not an invitation. "Family and partners will be there. We'll discuss your future afterward." I knew what that meant, one last chance to bend before he broke me off completely. I didn't argue. I simply said I'd be there. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of code and anxiety. Harbor Shield reached its 100th user in the closed beta, and Dylan started sketching a plan for a proper launch. Joanna told me she'd be in New York that same weekend and wanted to meet our team in person. "You've built something solid," she said. "You should be proud." When I told Maya that Joanna might come to the dinner as my mentor, she raised an eyebrow. "You're really going to let her see that circus?" she asked. I shrugged. "She'll see where I came from." Maya looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "Then let her see what you've built too." Graduation day arrived with the kind of weather that made the city shimmer. I walked across the stage, accepted the diploma, and smiled for photos that would never make it onto my parents' mantle. While my classmates celebrated, I went back to the apartment to change. The dinner was set for 7 at a rooftop ballroom overlooking Manhattan. The invitation had been embossed in gold, every letter polished like a trophy. When I arrived, the setting was exactly as I expected: white roses, crystal glasses, the family crest engraved on the menus. My father stood near the entrance, shaking hands with colleagues from the firm. My mother floated beside him, every gesture practiced. For a moment, I wondered if they'd even notice I'd come. Then my father's eyes met mine, and the air shifted. He smiled the way people do when they're about to win an argument. "Nora," he said, kissing my cheek, "I'm glad you could make it." The words were warm, but his grip on my arm wasn't. "Try to keep tonight simple," he whispered. "There's no need to make things awkward." I didn't answer. I took my seat beside Maya and Joanna, who'd arrived just before me. They both noticed the tension immediately. Joanna leaned over and murmured, "You don't owe anyone a performance tonight." I thanked her quietly, even though we both knew that wasn't how this family worked. The dinner dragged on every toast, another reminder of the legacy I'd chosen to leave behind. My Uncle Robert spoke first, recounting the generations of integrity the Whitfields had built. My father followed, turning the speech into something closer to a sermon. "Our family stands for tradition," he said, his voice carrying across the tables. "We build futures that endure." His gaze found mine. Some of us forget that now and then. My throat tightened, but I stayed still. The silverware clinked softly as waiters cleared plates. When dessert arrived, I knew what was coming. My father stood again, tapped his glass, and waited for the room to fall silent. "Tonight," he began, "we celebrate a milestone. But we also face a truth." His words were slow, deliberate, as though he wanted each one to sting. "My daughter has chosen a path that no longer aligns with the Whitfield legacy. After much thought, we've decided she will no longer be part of our family enterprise or our family name." A ripple of disbelief moved through the room. I heard someone whisper my name, and then nothing. My mother looked down at her plate. My uncle stared at his hands. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then I felt something steady rise inside me. Not anger, not shame, just a quiet certainty that this was the moment I had been building toward. I reached for my clutch and stood. The room stilled again, the sound of my chair scraping against marble louder than any word. I walked to the head table, placed a manila folder in front of my father, and leaned close enough for only him to hear. "You're right," I said softly. "I'm not part of your legacy. I'm building mine." He blinked confused as I turned and walked away. No one stopped me. Not my mother, not my uncle, not even the old family friends who had watched me grow up. I heard my name once more as I reached the elevator, Maya's voice quick and anxious, but I kept walking until the night air hit my face. The city below looked almost peaceful. From the edge of that rooftop, thousands of lights, each one belonging to someone who had made a choice. I stepped inside the elevator, the doors sliding shut behind me, and for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of silence shift from punishment to freedom. When the elevator reached the lobby, Joanna and Maya were waiting by the doors. Maya's eyes were wide, searching mine. "What was in the folder?" she asked, her voice low. I smiled faintly. "The contract," I said. "Series A funding, $12 million signed and sealed." Joanna let out a slow breath and nodded. "Then it's done," she said. We stepped outside together, the air cold but honest. Somewhere above us, my father was probably realizing what I just handed him, a future he no longer had any control over. I didn't need to look back to know that nothing would ever be the same again. The night of the dinner played on a loop in my mind for days. The clinking glasses, the sudden hush, the weight of his voice echoing through the room. Those details stayed sharp as if they'd been carved there. But what came afterward was quieter. The news traveled fast. By the next morning, a photo from the dinner had surfaced on an alumni message board. Someone had posted a caption beneath it, "Whitfield heir disowned at graduation, walks away smiling." Within hours, it was everywhere. I stayed inside for most of that weekend, laptop, closed curtains drawn. The city kept moving outside the window, cars honking and sirens cutting through the noise, but I couldn't make myself care. Then my phone buzzed. It was Joanna. "They're calling," she said simply. "Tech outlets, reporters, investors. You're the story now." Her voice was calm, but I could hear what she wasn't saying. There was no way to hide anymore. By noon, my inbox was full. Some messages offered congratulations. Others demanded interviews. The photo of me sliding the manila folder across the table had become a headline. People called it bold, dramatic, calculated. They argued about whether I'd planned it all. The truth was simpler than that. I hadn't wanted a scene. I just couldn't let him rewrite who I was. That evening, Thomas called. I watched his name flash on the screen, then fade as the call went to voicemail. A minute later, a text came through instead. "What did you give me? The press is hounding me. Take it down." I set the phone face down and left it that way. I couldn't erase what had happened, and for the first time, I didn't want to. Harbor Shield's website traffic spiked overnight. By the following week, we had hundreds of new beta signups and messages from companies asking for demos. Dylan called it the accidental PR miracle, though none of us felt like celebrating. We were too busy trying to keep up with the sudden attention. Joanna arranged a meeting with a PR consultant named Lillian Cross. a woman who had seen enough startup scandals to know when silence was smarter than spin. You'll get pulled in every direction, Lillian warned, flipping through her notebook. Everyone wants your story. My advice: keep it simple. Talk about the work, not the family. Let the product speak first. I agreed. The next time Forbes called, I gave a 2-sentence quote about Harbor Shield's mission and declined to comment on my father. The article ran under the headline, "The Founder Who Built a Fortress," but outside those polished words, the storm was still building. My father's firm released a statement about private family matters, but clients began to pull back quietly. Rumors about his temper, his outburst at the dinner, and his estranged daughter's success made their way into whispers around Manhattan. The same circles that once applauded him now turned cautious. Then an email arrived from my mother. The subject line was short. "Be careful." Inside, just one sentence. "You've embarrassed your father, Nora. He's angry. You don't know what he's capable of when cornered." I read it 3 times before closing my laptop. There was no warmth, no apology, just warning. I didn't reply. A few nights later, the doorbell rang. It was close to 10 and the sound startled me. Maya looked up from the couch, expecting someone, she asked. I shook my head. The buzzer rang again, longer this time. I walked to the intercom, pressed the button, and froze at the sound of his voice. "Nora, open the door. My father." My hands went cold. Maya stood watching my face. I didn't move. "Nora," he said again, louder now. "We need to talk." I could hear him pacing on the other side of the glass. When I didn't answer, the footsteps stopped. A moment later, a thin envelope slid under the door. His shadow lingered for a while, then disappeared. I picked up the envelope after he left. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in his sharp, precise handwriting. "You've made this personal. If your company damages my reputation, I will respond accordingly. No greeting, no name, just a threat." I folded it once and locked it in my desk drawer. The next morning I met Joanna at a cafe in Soho. She arrived already knowing. "He came to your apartment," she said softly. "Maya called me." I nodded. "He's unraveling." Joanna stirred her coffee, thinking. "Then you've already won," she said finally. I didn't feel like I had. It felt less like victory and more like loss, like shedding the last layer of something that had once been home. That night, Maya and I ordered tacos and sparkling water to celebrate the Forbes feature. We sat cross-legged on the office floor, the glow from our monitors washing the walls blue. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass. I smiled and tapped mine against hers. The sound was small but steady. Over the next few weeks, we worked harder than ever. Harbor Shield signed its first pilot contract, a mid-sized healthcare provider in Oregon that wanted full data protection. The moment their signed agreement hit my inbox, I just stared at it. The logo in the corner, the signature at the bottom, it was real. We were no longer just testing theories. We were defending real people's information. When the announcement went live, messages poured in from classmates, professors, even a few relatives who had stayed silent through everything. Most wanted to say they always knew I'd do something big. I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't know what to say. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail, the handwriting unmistakably older. My grandfather's. I hadn't heard from him in years. Inside was a short note written in clean, deliberate script. "Nora, I spent most of my life believing our name was worth preserving above all else. You've shown us something better, the power of walking away from what corrupts you. I am proud of you, even if your father never says it. I am." I sat at my desk for a long time with that letter open in front of me, the words swimming slightly through tears I hadn't expected. Somewhere in the shadows of the Whitfield legacy, someone had finally seen me. A week later, Harbor Shield's first pilot went live. The system integrated cleanly, the alerts came through on time, and the company's feedback was glowing. When I told Joanna, she smiled in that small way she had when something mattered. "That's your proof," she said. "Not the headlines. This." The following morning, another email from Forbes landed in my inbox, founder of Harbor Shield, how Nora Whitfield turned silence into cybersecurity. The piece was measured, thoughtful, focused on the work. It mentioned my family only once in a single line about a public disowning at graduation. That was all. But even that brief mention was enough to reignite the story. My phone lit up with messages, some from strangers who called me brave, others from people who said I was ungrateful. I ignored most of them until one subject line caught my eye. I read the article. It was from my mother. Her message was short. "You look beautiful in the photo. I won't defend your father. I just want you to know I saw what happened and didn't stop him. That's my shame to carry. If you ever want to talk, I'll be here." I didn't know how to answer, so I didn't. But I saved the email just in case. For a while, things felt almost still. The noise faded, replaced by a rhythm of work coffee and quiet evenings on the balcony. We were planning a second funding round, and Joanna was preparing us for the pitch. I told myself the worst was behind me. I wanted to believe it, but I'd underestimated how long my father's reach could stretch and how unwilling he was to accept defeat. Because just as Harbor Shield began to rise, a new message arrived that would shake everything again. It was from a potential partner in San Francisco, canceling our upcoming meeting without explanation. Attached at the bottom was a note. "We've been advised of potential conflicts tied to your family's legal disputes. Best to postpone for now." That was when I realized the battle wasn't over. It had only changed shape. When the San Francisco partner backed out, it hit like a quiet punch. The message was polite, all the right words in the right order, but the meaning was sharp and deliberate. Someone had gotten to them. Joanna called the same afternoon. "You've been blacklisted in one of their circles," she said, her voice low. "We'll find out who started it, but be careful how you respond." I didn't need to ask who it was. My father's reach was longer than I had imagined. The next few weeks felt like walking through fog. Every potential client came with hesitation. Every email chain seemed to stall mid-conversation. A contact at a venture firm even admitted off the record that certain parties had raised questions about Harbor Shield's reputation. I didn't ask for details. I already knew the pattern whisper campaigns, half-truths, the quiet power of suggestion. It was how my father had won cases for decades. Maya noticed the change before I said anything. "Something's off," she murmured one morning, scrolling through the latest analytics. "We should be gaining traction, not losing it." Dylan nodded. "Traffic steady, but conversions dropped by a third." He paused, glancing at me. "It's external. Someone's freezing us out." I didn't confirm it aloud, but the silence between us was answer enough. That night, I went for a walk along the East River. The wind was sharp, cutting through my jacket, but it cleared my head. I'd built my life on code logic precision rules that made sense, but this wasn't a problem I could debug. It was personal. My father was trying to suffocate the company without touching it directly. He wanted to make Harbor Shield uninvestable, untouchable, a liability tied to my last name. The following week, Joanna set up a meeting with a new contact, a venture partner named Alan Pierce from Westbridge Capital. "He's good," she told me. "Old school professional, doesn't scare easily. Just be transparent." I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe near the Flatiron Building. Alan was in his late 40s, gray at the temples, with a cautious but kind expression. He listened more than he spoke. When I finished walking him through the system, he leaned back and said, "Impressive." "I've heard your name before, though. Not all flattering." My stomach tightened. From where I asked. He hesitated, then sighed. "Someone's feeding a story that you're in legal conflict with your family's firm. That Harbor Shield used proprietary code from one of their old cases." I blinked, stunned. "That's a lie," I said quietly. He nodded. "I figured as much. But rumor doesn't care about truth. It cares about volume." When he left, he shook my hand firmly. "I like what you're building," he said. "I'm not pulling out, but you'll need to fight smart. Make noise, but make it the right kind." It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was something proof that not everyone was willing to be scared off. Back at the office, I gathered Maya and Dylan for a late-night meeting. "We're going public," I said. "No drama, just transparency. We'll show who we are, what we do, and let the facts outshine the rumors." Dylan frowned. "That could backfire if we look defensive." I nodded. "Then we won't defend. We'll lead." Maya smiled faintly. Finally, she said, "Let's show them what silence can build. We spent the next week filming a short documentary-style video. Maya directed it, keeping the tone calm and clear. I talked about data privacy, about trust, about how Harbor Shield wasn't built for headlines, but for protection. There were no digs at my family, no bitterness, just purpose. Joanna arranged to premiere it through a tech ethics conference online. When it aired, it reached 30,000 views in 2 days. Comments poured in from small business owners, healthcare workers, even teachers thanking us for caring about digital safety. For the first time since the fallout, the narrative shifted back to the work, but my father didn't take silence as surrender. The next move came through legal mail. A cease and desist letter arrived at our office, accusing Harbor Shield of defamation and misuse of family intellectual property. Joanna read it twice and shook her head. "It's smoke," she said. "They have no grounds. He's bluffing to scare you." Still, the sight of his signature at the bottom made my hands shake. That night, I called my mother for the first time in months. She answered on the second ring. "Nora." Her voice was soft, surprised. "Mom," I said quietly, "he sent legal threats to my company." There was a pause, then a long sigh. "He's unraveling," she said finally. "I've never seen him like this. It's not about the company anymore, it's about control." Her words came out like a confession. "Be careful," she added. "He'll burn everything to stay in charge." After the call, I sat in the dark for a long time. The glow of the computer screen reflected in the window a faint outline of everything I'd fought to build. It struck me how little control he had left and how dangerous that made him. Joanna moved quickly, hiring a firm to handle the legal threats and quietly alerting her network about the smear attempts. Within days, a few of the worst rumors were traced back to an anonymous email account tied to an IP address near my father's office. The evidence wasn't public yet, but it was enough to start turning tides behind the scenes. Alan called a week later. "Funny thing," he said lightly. "The same people spreading lies about you just retracted their statements. I take it you've got strong allies." By early summer, Harbor Shield was stabilizing again. The Oregon pilot had gone well enough that the company signed a full-year contract. 2 new clients came on board, both referrals. Our first real revenue hit the account, and for the first time since graduation night, I exhaled without fear. Maya and I stayed late that Friday ordering pizza and watching the skyline from the office balcony. "It's strange," she said softly. "We started this in a dorm room, and now—" She gestured toward the glowing windows of downtown. "Now it's a company." I smiled. "Now it's a home," I said. When I checked my phone that night, there was a message from my grandfather. He'd read the Forbes feature. "Proud of you." The family name needed a new kind of strength. I read it twice, the warmth in those words, quietly undoing something inside me that had been wound too tight for too long. The next week, Joanna told me she was nominating Harbor Shield for a National Innovation Award. "It's a long shot," she said, "but the recognition could change everything." I agreed, though. A part of me worried what new line my father might cross to stop me. But then I thought of the manila folder, the rooftop the moment I chose to walk away. The strength that once came from silence had turned into something else, now presence. We were no longer hiding, no longer waiting for permission. We were standing in the open. Summer settled over the city with heavy air and longer days. The team grew to 6 people, each of them bringing energy that filled the room. When I left the office late one night, I caught my reflection in the glass door, tired, focused, steady. For the first time, I didn't see the girl who needed to prove anything. Still, one question lingered in the quiet: how far would my father go? Before realizing that his power was gone, I didn't have to wait long to find out. Because the following month, as Harbor Shield prepared for its biggest pitch, yet someone unexpected appeared at the next investor event, someone who should have had no reason to be there. And when I looked across the crowded room, I saw him watching me. The ballroom in San Francisco buzzed with the usual pre-pitch tension voices, low suits, crisp screens glowing with last-minute slide edits. I stood near the back of the room with a cup of water watching as teams rehearsed lines they'd practiced 100 times. Harbor Shield was slated to present midway through the event, and Joanna had flown in that morning to help us prepare. She was calm, composed, the kind of steady presence that steadied everyone else. We'd spent months rebuilding momentum after my father's smear campaign. The Oregon contract had grown into a success story, and new clients were finally signing on. Our numbers were strong, our case airtight. This was supposed to be our turning point, the day we proved Harbor Shield wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Then I saw him. Across the room, standing near a cluster of investors, was my father. He wore the same gray tailored suit I'd seen him wear to court, the one he always called his winning uniform. For a moment, I thought I was imagining him. But when he turned slightly, I caught the familiar stiffness in his posture, the polished smile that never reached his eyes. He didn't belong there. He had no business reason to be. And yet there he was, scanning the crowd like a man inspecting a case file. Joanna followed my gaze, her expression hardening. "Don't let him throw you off," she whispered. "He's here for a reaction. Don't give him one." I nodded, but my hands felt cold. He didn't approach, at least not right away. Instead, he lingered, speaking quietly to a few people I recognized, one of the event organizers, a reporter from a major tech outlet, and finally, Alan Pierce. I watched Alan's expression shift from neutral to cautious. My father said something gestured subtly toward me, and Alan's brow furrowed. I turned away before our eyes could meet. When it was our turn to present, I stepped onto the stage under the bright white lights. The screen behind me lit up with the Harbor Shield logo, clean and simple. My voice felt steady, but my pulse raced beneath it. I talked about data integrity, user privacy, and the growing need for security systems that didn't treat people like products. The crowd listened closely. A few heads nodded. Somewhere in the back I saw my father fold his arms. When I finished, the applause was polite but restrained, the kind of reaction that suggested interest tempered by uncertainty. Joanna handled the Q&A like a shield, intercepting a pointed question about family legal entanglements that I knew had come straight from him. "All resolved," she said smoothly. "Our technology has been independently verified and audited by third parties." Her tone left no room for doubt. After the session, I found a quiet hallway outside the main hall. The hum of conversation faded behind me. For a few seconds, I let myself breathe. Then his voice came from the other end of the corridor. "You really think this will last?" I turned. He stood near the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, expression calm, in the way only people practiced in intimidation can manage. "You're trespassing," I said quietly. "This isn't your world." He smiled, the same cold, precise curve of his mouth I'd seen in every courtroom photo of him. "Oh, but it is. You built your company using my name, my reputation. Don't fool yourself into thinking you're separate." I took a step closer. "I didn't use your name. I erased it." The smile faltered for the briefest moment. "You're playing with fire, Nora," he said finally. "The press might adore you now, but they'll turn. They always do. And when they do, you'll find out exactly how much that last name still matters." Before I could answer, Joanna appeared beside me. "This conversation is over," she said evenly. "You're not listed as a guest, Mr. Whitfield. If you don't leave, I'll have security escort you out." He looked at her, then back at me. For a heartbeat, something unreadable flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but something closer to disbelief. "You really think you've won?" he said softly. "But you'll see. There's no such thing as walking away from a legacy." He turned and left without another word. I didn't move until the sound of his footsteps disappeared down the hall. That evening, the event closed with a reception overlooking the bay. The room glowed with string lights and soft jazz, a calm contrast to the tension of the day. Alan approached our table holding 2 glasses of champagne. "You handled yourself well," he said, offering one to me. "Whatever that was earlier, you didn't let it show." "Thank you," I said. "And I'm sorry you had to witness that." He waved it off. "Families are complicated. Business is worse. But your product, your pitch, that's what people will remember." He paused, lowering his voice. He tried to warn me off again before he left. I told him the only thing I care about is integrity. For the first time all day, I smiled. "Then you'll fit right in with us." That night, I flew back to New York with Joanna and Maya. The plane was quiet, the cabin lights dim. As the city lights appeared below, I looked out the window and thought of the way my father's expression had changed in that hallway. Not triumphant, not smug, but uncertain. It was the look of a man who had lost his hold on something he thought would always belong to him. The following week, our pitch closed successfully. Westbridge Capital invested $6.5 million into Harbor Shield's Series A round. The announcement spread quickly, appearing in every major tech publication by morning. Reporters called it a comeback story, though for me, it felt more like closure. Joanna scheduled a press conference to formalize the partnership. Standing on stage, I saw rows of cameras flash as I spoke about data ethics and the need for accountability in the digital age. When I finished, the applause was louder than before, genuine, unrestrained. For a brief moment, the noise blurred, replaced by the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. After the event, I spotted him again. My father stood near the back of the room, alone. This time his expression unreadable. No reporters around him, no colleagues at his side, just him, watching quietly. For a moment, neither of us moved. The crowd flowed between us, voices fading into a distant hum. Then our eyes met. There was no anger in his face now, no triumph, only recognition and understanding, perhaps, that whatever battle he'd been fighting was over. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I turned toward my team, who were waiting near the front, smiling, laughing, celebrating. That evening we gathered in the Harbor Shield office, 6 of us around a folding table covered in takeout containers and paper cups of champagne. The whiteboard behind us was full of notes for the next phase, new clients, new hires, new growth. Maya raised her glass. "To building something that lasts," she said. "And to choosing our own legacy." We clinked glasses. I looked around the table at the friends who had become family at the company that had once been a sketch on a napkin and felt something loosen in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost, only what I'd built. Later that night, as I walked home through quiet city streets, my phone buzzed. A message from my grandfather waited on the screen. "You've rewritten what it means to be a Whitfield. Your father may not say it, but he knows it. I'm proud of you." I stopped under a streetlight and read it twice, the words steadying me like a hand on my shoulder. For years, I'd believed silence was the only way to survive. But that night, I realized it could also be the space where something new begins. The next morning, Joanna mentioned a call from my grandfather. He wanted to meet in person. She smiled as she said it. "Sounds like it's time to close the circle," she told me. I didn't know what he planned to say or what I was ready to hear, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel afraid to find out. The meeting with my grandfather was set for a quiet Sunday morning. He chose his favorite cafe in Midtown, the same place he used to take me when I was a child for pancakes and stories about the early days of the family firm. I hadn't seen him in nearly 3 years, not since before the rift with my father widened into a canyon. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting near the window with a newspaper folded beside his cup. His hands looked thinner, his posture a little smaller, but his eyes, sharp and clear, hadn't changed at all. He stood when he saw me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he smiled faintly and said, "You've been busy." It was the gentlest understatement I'd heard in months. We sat, and the waiter appeared almost instantly, as if he knew not to let the silence linger too long. "I read about your company," my grandfather said, stirring his coffee. "Quite the success. You made a name for yourself faster than anyone expected." His words carried pride, but also something heavier. I waited. He set his spoon down and looked at me carefully. "You know, when your father and I built Whitfield & Co., we thought we were building legacy. But what you've done, it's something else. You've built meaning." I didn't know how to answer that. The last few years had been so tangled in conflict that the word family felt foreign on my tongue. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," I said quietly. He waved a hand. "You didn't. You showed courage. The firm can survive scandal, it always has. What it can't survive is arrogance." Thomas needed to be reminded of that. The name landed like a stone between us. I could feel the question forming but didn't want to ask it. He filled the pause for me. "He's struggling, Nora. His reputation took a hit after the dinner after the leaks. Clients pulled away. But the truth is, it wasn't you that did that. It was him, the way he handled it. People saw who he really was." He leaned back, sighing softly. "He's been quieter lately. Spends most of his time at the lake house. Your mother visits every week, though she says he barely talks. I tried to imagine him there, away from the city, away from the courtrooms that fed his sense of control, and I couldn't. "Does he ever ask about me?" I asked. My grandfather smiled, but there was sadness in it. He won't admit it, but yes. He reads every article about Harbor Shield, keeps a copy of that Forbes piece in his study. I looked down at my hands. "That was never the point," I said. "I just wanted to build something honest," I know he replied. "And you did." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old photograph, a black and white snapshot of me at 9 years old, standing next to a clunky desktop computer in their house, grinning proudly as my father looked over my shoulder. "He was proud of you once," my grandfather said softly. "He just didn't know how to stay that way." For a long time we sat in quiet understanding. When the check came, my grandfather insisted on paying. As we stood to leave, he said something that stayed with me. "You didn't destroy the family name, Nora. You reminded it what integrity looks like. That's worth more than legacy." I hugged him before we parted. His frame felt smaller than I remembered, but his words carried weight that reached every part of me. That evening, I returned to the Harbor Shield office. The team was working late, the soft buzz of conversation mixing with the hum of computers. Maya looked up from her desk when I walked in. "How was it?" she asked. "Different," I said, smiling faintly. "But good." Dylan handed me a stack of documents, new partnership proposals, pilot expansions, and projections for the next quarter. "We're officially profitable," he said, trying to sound casual, but grinning anyway. It took a moment for that to sink in. We had built something from scraps and long nights and silence, and now it was standing on its own. The pride that filled the room was quiet but deep. We celebrated with takeout and laughter that came easier than it had in a long time. Later that week, Joanna organized a press release to announce our next funding milestone. The headline ran the following morning: "Harbor Shield closes Series A, expands to healthcare and education sectors." The response was overwhelming. New clients reached out, and the media labeled us one of the most promising cybersecurity startups on the East Coast. It felt surreal, not because I doubted we'd get there, but because of how far I'd come since that night on the rooftop. But the real moment of closure came a few days later, after a conference in Boston. I had just finished a panel discussion on data ethics when I saw him again. My father. He was standing near the back of the auditorium, away from the crowd. No entourage, no press, just him. For a heartbeat, everything else faded. The applause, the chatter, the clicking cameras. He looked older than I remembered, the sharpness in his face softened by something I couldn't name. We didn't speak, not right away. I walked over slow and cautious, unsure of what this meeting would bring. He broke the silence first. "You've done well." His voice was quiet, steady. I searched his expression for sarcasm but found none. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once, looking down at the floor, then back at me. "I came to see it for myself," he said. "I didn't think I'd understand what you were doing, but I do now." There was a pause. "You built something good, Nora, something that works." I didn't know if that was an apology or just a statement of fact. Either way, it was more than I'd ever expected. "I didn't do it to prove you wrong," I said carefully. "I did it to make something right." He exhaled slowly, as if the words stung, but also released something he'd been holding for too long. "Your grandfather says you visit him often," he said. I nodded. "He's proud of you." He smiled faintly. "He told me that too." The silence that followed wasn't strained. It was tired, but human. For the first time in years, I saw not the lawyer or the patriarch, but the man beneath it all. He seemed smaller, humbled in a way that didn't demand sympathy, only understanding. "I should go," he said finally, "but I wanted to say it in person." "Thank you," I replied. He hesitated, then added, "Take care of yourself." And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd like he'd never been there at all. I stood for a long time in that emptying auditorium, watching the doorway where he'd stood. There was no grand reconciliation, no tears, no promises of family dinners. But something had shifted, a quiet acknowledgement that the war was over. When I returned to New York, the team was already planning the next product launch. Joanna handed me a printed agenda, smiling. "You ready for the next chapter?" she asked. I looked around at the people who had chosen to stand beside me. the team that had become my real family, the office that had become home, and nodded. "Yeah," I said. "I think I finally am." That night, as I left the office, the city stretched wide and endless beneath a deep blue sky. The buildings glowed like signals in the dark, each window a reminder that light doesn't need permission to exist. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew one thing for certain. The name Whitfield no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a story rewritten. And in the quiet between the streetlights and the sound of my own footsteps, I realized the story wasn't ending. It was just beginning to breathe on its own. When autumn came, New York felt softer. The sharp heat of summer had lifted, replaced by air that carried a calm kind of purpose. Harbor Shield had grown into something solid, an office full of small victories and the quiet rhythm of people who believed in what they were building. We weren't chasing headlines anymore. We were building roots. Our second product launch took place in a refurbished loft overlooking the East River. The room wasn't grand, but it was ours: clean white walls, string lights, and a long table covered with laptops and coffee mugs. As our clients and investors filled the space, I caught sight of every person who had helped make it happen. Maya laughing with the developer, Dylan checking data feeds, Joanna greeting guests like a proud mentor. For a moment, I just watched them, remembering the nights we thought we might not make it past the next rent payment. When it was time to speak, I didn't use notes. I just told the truth. I talked about how Harbor Shield began in a dorm room built by 3 students who wanted to protect people who couldn't afford to protect themselves. I talked about the power of starting small, of refusing to let someone else decide your worth. The applause at the end wasn't loud. It was steady, warm, and real. Afterward, my grandfather arrived quietly, leaning on his cane, but smiling wider than I'd seen in years. He shook Joanna's hand, hugged Maya, and told Dylan that his spreadsheets had saved civilization. Then he pulled me aside. "You've done it," he said. "You took a name that was about control and turned it into one about contribution." His eyes were tired, but bright. "You didn't abandon the family, Nora. You redefined it." A week later, I visited him at his house upstate. He had framed the article about Harbor Shield's award and placed it beside an old photograph of my grandmother. "She would have liked your courage," he said softly. We sat on the porch until sunset, the light falling through the trees like old gold. I didn't realize how much I'd needed that peace until it settled around us. Back in the city, life moved forward in small, ordinary ways. Our team expanded. Clients called with thank you notes instead of complaints. The office stayed open late, but the exhaustion felt different now. It was the kind that comes from fulfillment, not fear. One evening, as I packed up to leave, I noticed the manila folder on my desk, the same one I'd slid across that dinner table months before. I kept it not as proof, but as reminder. That night had ended one story and started another. Sometimes I still think about my father. We haven't spoken since that day in Boston, but I've heard from my mother that he's doing better. He scaled back at the firm, spends more time by the water. I don't know if he'll ever apologize, but I also don't need him to. What once felt like a wound has turned into something quieter, understanding. Some people never learn how to love without control, and some of us have to learn how to live without their approval. My mother sends short messages now and then, photos of the garden notes about my grandfather's health, gentle reminders that she's still there. I write back when I can. The words are careful but kind. Distance can be a kind of peace too. Harbor Shield's next goal is expanding into schools, teaching teenagers about privacy and safety online. Maya calls it our human layer of defense. Every time I see her sketch out ideas for that program, I realize how much of my life has been built from the people who chose to believe when no one else did. That's what family turned out to mean, not the people who shared your name, but the ones who shared your fight. On quiet nights, I still visit the office balcony. From up there, the skyline stretches wide and endless, glittering like circuitry across the dark. I remember the first time I stood here scared and unsure, wondering if walking away from my family meant losing everything that defined me. Now I know it was the only way to find myself. Legacy isn't the name you inherit. It's what you build when no one's watching. It's the honesty. You protect the people. You lift the choices you make when no one else believes you can. For me, it wasn't about proving my father wrong. It was about proving that I could live right. So much of life is about letting go without bitterness, about building something from what others tried to break. And maybe that's the quiet kind of justice we get. In the end, not revenge, not triumph, just peace, earned one choice at a time. If you've ever had to walk away from something that hurt to make room for something better, I hope this story reminds you that it's okay. You're allowed to rewrite your story. You're allowed to build your own legacy. And if it spoke to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe they'll remember that strength doesn't always roar. It often starts in silence and ends with peace.